Hi everyone. Today, as part of the Canadian 24-hour movement guidelines, I will talk more about sleep and specifically the part about sleep duration. My name is Jean-Philippe Chaput and I was the sleep content expert for the Canadian 24-hour movement guidelines for adults, and I will talk about sleep duration and the association with health outcomes in adults. And the paper, if you want to know more, is published in the Journal of Applied Physiology, Nutrition and Metabolism in 2020. There are three take-home messages with this presentation. First, a U-shaped association between sleep duration and health outcomes is observed, so both short sleepers and long sleepers are more at risk of adverse health outcomes. Second, a sleep duration of 7 to 8 hours per day is most favorably associated with health outcomes among adults and older adults. And finally, modification of the effect by age is not evident, meaning that the associations were very similar for younger adults and older adults. A bit of background. Insufficient sleep, defined as less than 7 hours of sleep per day in adults, has become a public health concern around the world. And in Canada, we know that about 1/3 of adults sleep less than 7 hours per day, and lack of sleep impacts activity levels and different health outcomes. This is the first overview of systematic reviews on sleep duration and health outcomes in adults aged 18 years and more. And we know that sleep duration recommendations are important for surveillance, to help inform policies and interventions, and can be used to educate the general public about healthy sleep. The main objective of this overview of systematic reviews was to determine the sleep duration associated with overall health in adults and examine the impact of age on this association. Methods. 4 electronic databases were searched for systematic reviews published in the past 10 years, so 2009 to 2019. The population was community-dwelling adults aged 18 years and more. The intervention or exposure or comparator were various levels of sleep duration. In order to avoid overlap in primary studies, we use a priority list to choose a single review per outcome, so the best one, and reviews that examine the effect of age and those that looked at dose response were prioritized by our priority list. We had a long list of outcomes. We had 8 critical outcomes and 6 important outcomes. So for the critical outcomes, we have mortality, the incidence of cardiovascular disease, the incidence of type 2 diabetes, the incidence of depression, the incidence of cognitive disorders, cognitive function, falls, and accidents and injuries. For the important outcomes, we had the incidence of obesity, biomarkers of cardiometabolic risk, bone health, health-related quality of life, work productivity, and finally physical activity and/or standard behavior. Results: 36 systematic reviews were eligible, and finally 11 were included in this paper. The reviews included more than 4 million participants coming from 30 countries, and sleep duration was assessed subjectively in 96% of studies, so via self-report, and 78% of studies in the reviews were prospective cohort studies. Key findings now. We found that a U-shaped association between sleep duration and health outcomes was observed, so both short sleepers and long sleepers were more at risk of adverse health outcomes. Second, the dose response curve showed that the sleep duration that was most favorably associated with health outcomes was 7 to 8 hours per day using self-report. No reviews reported a possible modification of the effect by age among the critical outcomes examined, meaning that it was the same association for adults and older adults. And finally, the quality of the evidence ranged from low to high across different health outcomes. As part of the 24-hour movement guidelines, the sleep duration recommendations are 7 to 9 hours of sleep per day for adults aged 18 to 64 years, and 7 to 8 hours of sleep per day for adults aged 65 years or older, consistent with the National Sleep Foundation guidelines in the US. So why not using 7 to 8 for adults? I think we know that long sleep does not cause adverse health, but is associated with underlying health problems such as chronic pain and depression. And we don't want someone who needs, for example, 9 hours of sleep per night to reduce it to 8 hours. So I think we need to give a bit more flexibility, and it's important to be consistent with other guidelines around the world. What are some of the implications for public health? We know, for example, that the sleep needs are different between people, which means that, for example, 9 hours of sleep per day may well be the optimal duration for someone, but for someone else it can be quite different. And we don't want to recommend less sleep to someone, for example, that needs 9 or 10 hours of sleep per day. And with advances in wearable devices, the future studies will need to look at how it impacts sleep duration recommendations, because as you remember, 96% of studies use self-reported sleep. And if we use device-based measures, I think most of the time the numbers will be lower. So keep in mind that those recommendations are using self-reported sleep. In conclusion, the sleep duration that is most favorably associated with health outcomes in adults is around 7 to 8 hours per day, with no modification of the effect by age. So similar associations for adults and older adults. If you want to have more information about this study, or if you have any other questions, my email address is here, and you have below the sponsors and the other organizations involved in those guidelines. Thank you very much for your attention.